Bienvenidos a Besos de NYC. I'm Patricia Wedding, supporting small businesses, artists, and entrepreneurs, and the culture of NYC. Now, if you've ever seen my videos before, you'd know that my goal is to help inspire you and empower you to make change. So today, I'll be introducing you to Elin Miller, who was kind enough to sit down with me and share their personal experience with COVID-19 and how it has transformed and changed their outlook on life, on their career, and on the possibilities for change. As you might already know, COVID-19 has highlighted the socioeconomic disparities that exist in today's American society. And we all have an obligation, I believe, to do our part to make change and to make sure that all families have food on the table, that everybody has access to vaccines, and that no one during this pandemic ends up homeless through no fault of their own. Leave me a comment and welcome any discussion. Click like, subscribe by hitting on my logo down below. And if you want any information on any of the topics that we touch on today, check out the description below. There'll be links there to articles and anything else I can offer you. Thank you for being here, and let's go meet Elin. How has COVID-19 personally affected you and your career?
Yeah, so again, like lots of New Yorkers, I was laid off right at the beginning of the pandemic in like the second or third week of March, as the industry I was working in just completely collapsed due to the pandemic and all the lockdowns.
What industry do you work in?
I work in the fine arts industry. I was a graphic designer, designing books for art museums and galleries.
And how was that industry affected?
That industry, the fine arts industry has, it relies on people being able to view art, right, to buy and sell it. Some of the biggest art fairs in the world, Art Basel Hong Kong, were completely shut down due to COVID, right, because nobody could be there in person to see artwork. And they have, moved some things virtually, different types of like art showings, and there is a sort of, there is some business that can be achieved that way, but in general, the art industry just contracted hugely once actual physical in-person viewing of art was essentially not able to happen due to lockdowns. And so as a result of that, right, a lot of different jobs in that industry just disappeared, including my own. And so,
which was your job
my job as a book designer. And so, I applied for unemployment pretty much right away. But it was in a period where there were like thousands of people applying for unemployment every day, every week. And so I actually never did get unemployment. The system was just so backed up. But I was very lucky in that I was only unemployed really for a month. Graphic design as an industry is very much about networking and making connections. And I was really lucky that at the job that I was working at, my boss, who had to lay me off, coincidentally is married to another graphic designer who happened to work in an industry, like an e-commerce industry that was expanding rapidly, of course, as everybody started having to order everything online instead of going to stores to purchase anything. And so I was able to get a job about a month later graphic designing for this other studio. And I obviously am in a lot of ways the exception to the rule, right? There are so many people who lost their job right at the beginning of the pandemic and still don't have work, and are now facing, unemployment expiration and are facing these really dire situations. But in that month that I was unemployed, that really pushed me to realize, like the only way that any of us are going to get out of this, right, is if we fight for our needs. If we fight for things like rent cancellation, if we fight for things like funding to stop layoffs. So I ultimately ended up getting involved with a couple of different political organizations, which I'm still organizing with to this day, including Socialist Alternative and Full-Time Tenant Union. And that's actually been a sort of silver lining to the whole pandemic for me. It's been really a growth experience, just in sort of expanding my own personal horizons. And in really like committing myself to something that isn't just my like 9-to-5 job. Before the pandemic, I sort of let my work take up my entire life. I was working, a lot of overtime all the time, and I was just sort of throwing myself into that and not much else. But this has really sort of forced me to expand my horizons of like what I'm interested in a little bit, and really forced me to reevaluate sort of what my priorities are. And it's been valuable for me.
Why did you think it was important to join a tenant union?
We thought that it was important, just because landlords have so much power over tenants, even in a state like New York, where tenants do have relatively strong protections. Landlords have this massive financial advantage where, and they have the advantage of being able to evict somebody, who's not paying their rent. And so, when we're in this situation where, thousands of tenants just cannot pay their rent, it's so important for us to all be collectively organized together and be able to like talk to each other about what we're dealing with, and be able to really put pressure on our landlord to listen to us in saying that we can't pay our rent. And it's important to just be doing that in an organized fashion together.
And for people who don't live in the city or haven't been financially impacted by COVID-19, can you explain what it means to be part of a tenant union if you're facing financial hardships due to COVID-19?
Yeah. Being part of a tenant union has been a really amazing experience, because it's allowed me to understand like what's going on in other renters' lives, and just hearing about so many different people's circumstances and how they've been affected by the pandemic, and even what their situations were like before the pandemic. And it's also allowed me, it's given me this resource of just being able to learn from other people's experiences too. Everybody sort of has dealt with tenant-related issues in some form or another, and everybody has this sort of different perspective to give on it. And I think just having all of those in one place and being able to talk about those with other people in like a dedicated space is really has been really important in helping me feel empowered as a tenant, and also just helping me understand like what being a renter in this city and in this state and in this country, just what that's like.
Has gaining an understanding of your legal rights as a tenant empowered you?
Yeah. Before I started organizing with Full-Time Tenant Union, I really had no idea what my rights were as a tenant. I knew that, New York had strong renters protections, but I didn't really know what that meant. And I had never been in a situation where I had to know what that meant. So, being in a tenant union has helped me understand, what my legal protections are as a tenant, because I've had access to like legal support, right, from like actual tenant lawyers, and also have been able to hear about people's experience as tenants going through the legal system, and what that's been like.
Has COVID affected your perspective on things in general?
I think one of the biggest things for me during COVID was, of course, like losing my job. My job was sort of like my whole life before the pandemic, and losing that forced me to really reevaluate sort of like what I was doing. It forced me to remind myself that my job wasn't like my only priority in my life, and that I had to sort of cultivate other things for me to do. And it also really radicalized me politically. It was just such a glaring, I think like when everything shut down and everyone was getting laid off, it was just such a glaring example of how deeply unequal our society is, right? Of how ordinary people are just left out to dry with no real fallback plan. Billionaires are getting richer and richer over the course of this pandemic, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think that's also, that's been just incredibly important in really pushing me from, being sort of interested in politics to being really actively engaged in politics and sort of organizing like on the ground, including in full-time tenant union.
How have these disparities come to light, and how have the wealthy been enriched?
Yeah, we live in a system that rewards wealth, right? For being wealthy, because we live in a world where we have, the economy, is so complicated, and we have the stock market, and there are so many sort of like loopholes in the stock market that allow people who have the money to invest in it to like exploit that investment. This is the same situation that we saw, in the 08-09 recession and the housing crisis, where there was all of this speculation, like financial speculation, that ultimately didn't pan out, and that's what led to this like contraction of the housing bubble really rapidly. Where ultimately, then the fallout of that came down to people being foreclosed on, right? People losing their homes. Whereas the banks that were making all of those speculations, right, and Wall Street got massive bailouts to the tune of trillions of dollars, right? Big corporations did too. And it's really a similar situation that we're seeing now in the pandemic, right? We're going through this set of negotiations again for another stimulus package. And the news just keeps getting grimmer and grimmer, right? Where we're seeing fewer and fewer, less and less of a push for like strong bailouts to ordinary people. Like the talk of like stimulus checks has continued to recede in strength. And yet, there are all of these protections for big businesses. There were talks of like liability protections from negligence due to like the pandemic, and there were talks of there are huge bailouts for industries, and so on and so forth,
including tax credits, exemptions, and tax loopholes for the wealthy and large corporations.
Of course, stock buybacks, tax loopholes. And I think like one of the most sort of one of the really like clear ways that we'll be seeing the effects of this inequality during the pandemic is that
what type of inequality?
Sorry, of wealth inequality, of class inequality, and of social inequality too. We'll be we're coming up on this period where budgets, state and city budgets, are being reevaluated, and we have these huge budget deficits. I think in New York it's several $1 billion of deficit, and there are sort of two different ways that states can and countries can generate revenue to close those deficits. The first is taxing the rich, right? And that's from my political perspective, what I would argue is the obvious and necessary solution. Because the rich have gotten these, hundreds of billions of dollars wealthier over the course of the pandemic, and frankly have the money to spare. They could cancel rent in a second by taxing the wealthy. But the other thing that we're going to be seeing, and we've actually already started seeing in cities like Chicago, and that I'm sure we'll see here in New York as well, and in New York City, are austerity budgets, which are budgets that include cuts to social services and like decreased government spending, as well as income taxes, higher property taxes for homeowners, and other sorts of revenue generating mechanisms that go to the working class and the middle class, as opposed to like what we would call the capitalist class, right, or the ruling class, the billionaires. And so it's sort of these two paths, right, that we're going to be seeing as we come up on this budget crisis. And we know that there's going to be a lot of money and a lot of lobbying power to get these austerity budgets in place, because that's the wealthy don't want to be taxed, right? They don't want to lose their billions of dollars. And it's going to take a real concerted fight back from ordinary people in order to put enough pressure on our legislators and our politicians to actually go against their corporate lobbyists, right? And the types of agendas that, big money is spending in legislative lobbying, and actually like put up enough of a fight to not, have spending cuts for desperately needed social services, and for things like canceling rent and housing the homeless and so on and so forth, and including all the way up until, distributing a vaccine, and who's going to be paying for that.
So what do you think are the most important issues our legislators should be focusing on?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there are a few things that sort of go hand in hand. In New York in particular, right, again, as we're coming up on this massive budget deficit, to me, the most important thing that legislators need to do right now is to levy progressive taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers, to generate revenue, to fund things like rent cancellation as we face this massive debt and eviction crisis, right? To do things like fund safe reopenings, including school reopenings. As we know, the school reopenings in New York City have been completely botched. There was no plan ever put in place really that allowed for safe school reopenings, despite having like 6 months of lockdown to prepare for that. There was never really any preparation. And to stop small businesses from closing, to stop workers from getting laid off. All of these things have to be funded by revenue, and the only place that revenue realistically will come from, right, short of massive federal intervention, which I think we can be sure is, if it does come, will not be fast enough to make the difference that it needs to. It has to come from taxing the rich.
Thank you for interviewing with me, sharing your COVID experience, and for all the phenomenal work you've been doing with Time Tenant Union. I think the silver lining for me has been getting to work with you and getting to know you. So thank you so much, Elin. I greatly appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I've met so many different people who I never would have met otherwise because of COVID, including you, including like lots of my neighbors, who I just never really would have talked to otherwise. And that's been so amazing, just to like meet wonderful new people.
It is interesting. I mean, before the pandemic, people really didn't speak to each other. Neighbors don't typically speak to each other in New York.
Right.
And now neighbors are communicating with one another, and we're trying to do everything that we can to support one another. It's a nice change.
Yeah, I feel like there's been this sort of, like, the barrier has been broken a little bit. Like, people feel more empowered to talk to their neighbors, and to just, like, ask, like, to see somebody in the hall and just say, hey, how are you doing? And that's, like, I think that's so crucial.
So I hope you enjoyed meeting Elin Miller, and that their story is inspirational and helps you to figure out how you can help and create change, help your neighbor, help your community, and feel good doing it. So till next time, hit like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on our next adventure. And besos de NYC. Hasta la próxima. This is Patricia Wedding sending you besos de NYC.